It is a pleasure being here with four excellent speakers for the second session of this school. And I have the pleasure to introduce my good friend, André Thiaville, because as you said, I was a postdoc in the group of André Thiaville and Jacques Miltat. André did his PhD in the propagation of Néel lines in magnetic garnets under the supervision of Jacques Miltat. Later, he moved to Tsukuba in Japan, where he studied magneto-optical properties of iron ultra-thin films in contact with noble metals. And since then, he has been involved with research groups in Japan. For instance, nowadays, he's a foreign member of the Magnetic Society of Japan. But André is based in Orsay at the Solid State Physics Laboratory, where he is the leader of the group in magnetic dynamics and imaging. So, André, thank you very much for joining us. And please, you can start whenever you want.
Okay, so thank you very much, José Miguel, for this very nice introduction. I start to share my screen. Is it okay like that? Do you see all the screen? Is it okay?
Yes, it's okay. We can see your screen.
Okay,
presentation.
So I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation to give a lecture about a topic which I find very interesting, and I try to show you why and how. So it's about, Dzerzhinsky-Moriya. So I will say DMI because I'm not Russian, it's difficult to pronounce Dzerzhinsky, and Skyrmions. So as it was said, I'm in France, in Orsay, and I'm very happy today to be in Saragossa, where there is a nice weather because it's raining just now in Orsay, I can see. So, well, I'm very happy. Okay, so I start by an introduction of what is DMI and what is interfacial DMI, especially for ultra-thin films. And then I will be showing consequences of this interaction and stressing especially the magnetic skyrmions. So, as it was said, it comes from Dzerzhinsky and then Moriya. So Dzerzhinsky is a Russian guy, and he published, in fact, it's only one paper here, but twice published, about the idea was to interpret what was called weak ferromagnetism. So experimentally, people were measuring the magnetic moment of the antiferromagnet, and they were finding that there was always a small moment. So for some time, it was called parasitic. And in fact, Néel was saying it was coming from defects and so on. But Dzerzhinsky, in this paper, takes the point of view at assuming that it is a real, not a parasitic effect, it's a real effect. And he tries to see how we can combine, from the structure, to have both an antiferromagnet in one direction and a ferromagnet in another direction. And he finds some lattices which allow this. You know, the Russians are very good for structure and symmetries and so on. And this is the paper. And in this paper, the next paper is Moriya, but let's come to Dzerzhinsky himself. He was studying samples which are very famous, iron Fa2O3, so hematite, or manganese, carbon, oxygen, or cobalt, carbonate. But if you take hematite, so alpha Fa2O3, it is an antiferromagnet, but this small moment. And what he's proposing is that in addition to the energy terms, which are like the exchange, there might be another form of exchange. And he says that it can happen if you don't have inversion symmetry and only by it's said by relativistic spin lattice interaction. Okay, so that's the basic proposal. And then Moriya, so why is his name associated with this is that Moriya, he was the first to propose a microscopic mechanism to explain where this interaction comes from. Moriya was working with Bill Anderson, so the one who invented super exchange. And in fact, it derives from the super exchange. So, but to begin with, this is math. If we want to generalize the exchange interaction, you know that you write usually that the exchange is, you have a spin Si, a spin Sj, and then you form the dot product Si dot Sj, and you multiply by the exchange constant. That's the high symmetry uniform Heisenberg exchange. If you want to generalize this, you can instead, between Si and Sj, introduce a matrix, okay? So it will be Si dot the matrix M, which depends in principle from I and J, applied to Sj. then this matrix you can always decompose in a symmetric part and an anti-symmetric part. The symmetric part, you know, it can be diagonalized, and if you diagonalize it, you will get 3 different values about the 3 axes. And this is what is called either pseudo-dipolar. At that time, it was called anisotropic exchange, or in modern terms now, where you will hear the name Kitaev Hamiltonian. So that's what you get. But okay, so this is known. And then the other part, which is the antisymmetric part, you know that you can always rewrite the antisymmetric matrix acting on a vector like a cross product of some vector times the vector you are applying it to. So then that's why this D vector, Dij, is coming here. And then if we look at the antisymmetric part of the energy, it will be Si dot, okay, Sj cross Dij, or if I reverse the order, it will be Si cross Sj dot Dij, where Dij is the Jaroszynski vector. Okay, and it has to be a scalar. So an important thing is that you need not to have an inversion symmetry, because if you have an inversion symmetry, you can exchange SISJ and then you get the opposite, so it will be 0. So in order that this term exists, you need to have no inversion symmetry. And this is, you can call it, if you want, anti-symmetric exchange. Okay, people prefer to say DMI. Okay.
Andre, let
yes.
me interrupt you just for a second. We cannot see you because I think your camera is switched off. So
okay, let me
better you switch it on.
Let me check. Sorry. I go to the okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I authorize. Excuse me. Yes. Sorry. It takes some time. Yes, it's it will start. Okay, here it is.
Okay, now it's okay.
I go back. Sorry. Yes, I could. In fact, I could not see myself. But,
thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you saw the slides.
Yes. I mean, the presentation was perfect.
Okay, but you want to check that I'm really presenting, right? Okay. Okay, so this is the small math. Okay, that's where it comes from. This form Si cross Sj dot vector Dij does not come out of nothing. It's just pure math, in fact. Okay, an important thing is that this vector Dij is a strange vector, because you could see, okay, I will take one vector and I will get everything, but no, you cannot, because if we take the bond Ij, the same bond Ij, I can start from I, go to J, or I can start from J and go to I, and it will be the same energy. And if you do this, in the one hand, you will have Dij, Si cross Sj, and on the other hand, you will have Dji and Sj cross Si. And if I turn around this cross product, then I get that Dji is minus Dij. Okay, so it means that Dij is not just a vector, because if you take the bond the other way, it will reverse. Okay, it's not a simple vector. This you have to keep in mind also. Then the Moria paper, it did not only show physical mechanism, microscopic mechanism, but he also gave symmetry rules which apply to this, or to the orientation of this D vector. So here you have two, so I and J are called A and B, and the Dij is this vector D here, the bold vector D. And then, of course, if there is invention center at C, which is the middle, then you get 0. But otherwise, depending on the symmetry elements of the crystal around AB, you will get some restrictions about the possible orientation of D. And this is, in fact, without looking at the mechanism. It's just by the symmetry of the system that you get it to prove them. So these apply whatever the mechanism is. Okay, so then this was proposed by Jaroszynski to explain the weak ferromagnetism. I told you initially that people were believing there might be other mechanisms. So at that time, so in the 60s, the only, let's call it proof that it was working, was to look at the magnetization properties of orthoferrites. So orthoferrites are weak antiferromagnets, and then it was, in this case, you see, you have, I was writing typically yttrium iron O3. It has two sublattices that are magnetized along the A-axis, and then there is a ferromagnetic moment in the C direction. So the Jaroszynski vector would be along B for the one lattice to the other. But to get the proof that it works, people had to do very complex experiments to measure in fact, the energy function. So how was is the torque changing as function of field at some angle? And then they say, okay, it might work, it might explain the things. But you would say that that it can be quite, this proof can be considered as a little weak, in fact. But okay, it was there. So another consequence of DMI, which was shown by Dzierżynski a little later, you see from it is 65, is to say that it can induce non-collinear structures. And in fact, you can, if you look at the form of the DMI energy, when is it minimum? To have it minimum, you need that SI and SJ are orthogonal, so not parallel. They need to be orthogonal, and moreover, they need both to be orthogonal to the vector Dij. So two neighboring spins should be at 90 degrees. And you see Dij has a given sign, so they should make an angle on one direction, not the opposite angle. Not, it can be plus 90 degrees, but not minus 90 degrees. So if this goes on, then you are making a rotation, a continuous rotation of the spin with in a given direction. So that's the basic mechanism. And in this paper, Dzierżynski looks, okay, it is in the case of antiferromagnet, but he write down a formulation to show that you should get this localized structure. But again, this was, you see, in 65, it was quite theoretical. And the interest in the DMI came to the forefront recently when people started to look at structures in a real space. There were some neutron diffraction, but when you see spots in neutron diffraction, you can always, it can come from a more complex thing. But in the recent year, you see, it's just 15 years ago, so yesterday. No, here is by Lorentz TEM, an observation of a strange compound. So it belongs to a series of compounds called the B20. They have this crystal structure, and the B20 structure has no inversion symmetry. And here you see, they see that at small temperature, they get an automatic stripe face. And it is attributed to this DMI, exactly as said before. This is so by Lorentz transmission electron microscopy. And there were also some fantastic images by spin polarized STM. So here, there is a series of papers by the group of Wiesenlanger in Hamburg. So here is the case. You take a tungsten 110 substrate, just one monolayer of manganese. So you know manganese by itself is an antiferromagnet. And by spin polarized STM, you can see the antiferromagnetic order, but you see on top of this, there are some modulations. And in this paper, there are people who did ab initio calculations to compute the value of DMI, and they found that it corresponds to what is shown here. Another case, another one, but it's still one monolayer manganese, but on another higher symmetry because it's 001 tungsten substrate, and it shows, you can see the modulation now. It's a high symmetry, so there is a square symmetry, so you can have a modulation both in one direction or in the orthogonal direction, and still the same. And then if you don't like antiferromagnets, this is here a ferromagnet. So on the same substrate, now you take two monolayers of iron, you get a ferromagnetic structure. And in fact, it is with this kind of sample that the spin polarized STM was demonstrated, because of this continuous rotation. That's a marvelous sample for STM, because anywhere where you go, you have domain walls to see. And here is the proof. Okay, I will not detail, but they apply the field. They change the tip magnetization from horizontal to here vertical, horizontal the opposite, vertical, and then they apply the field to check that indeed what they see in this sample is shown here. It is a cycloid where the moments are starting from to the left, up, to the right, down, and it goes on. And this is called the cycloid. And okay, we shall come back to this later. Whereas in the case I was showing before here, it is a helix. The moments are shown here in the plane, and you see they alternate from to the top of the drawing to the bottom to the top of the drawing, and in between they go up to down. You cannot see if they are up or down with Lorentz TEM, but okay, there are other experiments which show this. Okay, so these are the experimental evidences that show that you can indeed have modulated structure which rotate always the same way. So I will do again some little math to explain things. So we have this Dij vector. I can, if I call my direction as Ij as a U vector, which is uniform, unitary, this is a vector function of a vector direction. Vector D function of vector U. And we have seen before that it is odd, that d of minus u is minus d of u. So then use your mathematical knowledge. What can you think of as a simplest mathematical function which has these properties? So one is obviously the identity, that d of u is a scalar d times u. It will be odd, and it will be. And this is the isotropic bulk case. There is no preferred direction. And in fact, it corresponds in the first approximation very well to like these B20 compounds, the iron, cobalt, silicon I was showing. And then in the case where you have an interface, so you have a special direction I call z, which is the normal to the interface. In this case, you can construct a function which still has all the properties by taking z cross u. This one is still a vector, it will be still odd. And this one, this type of DMI corresponds, again, in the first approximation, very well to what we obtained on ultra-thin films deposited on the substrate. So if they are called like bulk and like interface case, in fact, all denominations is misleading, because you can make bulk compounds which are made of a pile of interfaces all the same way, and then they will have interface DMI even if they are really bulk. But that's it has been, okay, it's been used. Or also you can call them by their symmetry. So one is C and V, and the one I forgot. So sorry. Okay, and these two symmetries, they will provide either the bulk case, because you know this D is along U, so the vectors are rotating in the plane orthogonal to U, so it makes a helix, like a staircase in a tower. And whereas in an ultra-thin film, this you move in direction X, the Z is like that, the D is orthogonal is Y, and then you are rotating in the plane XZ, and this is called a cycloid. So what you, if you put a pen on your bicycle and you rotate along a wall, you will draw a cycloid, and then you will crash your bicycle. Okay, so this is the definition. And now I'd like to show what is the influence of DMI on the magnetic properties seen from the magnetic structures. And also I will speak on the ways to measure the DMI a little. So this is the DSISJ, that's the atomic form. So I come from micromagnetics, and in micromagnetics, we have a continuous description of the structure. So we need to change this to a continuous form. And this form of, so that I will be focusing mainly on interfacial DMI. So this one, then it gives this formula here. If you do the Taylor expansion carefully, you get this strange expression, which involves only first order derivative, which are not squared. You know, if you have exchange, it's first order derivative squared. Okay, so here they are to the first power and only the first derivatives. Okay, and then there is here a micromagnetic value, and which is as a unit of joule per square meter. So rather, the typical order of magnitude is millijoule per square meter, or even microjoule per square meter. This is the micromagnetic unit. So once we have a micromagnetic energy density, which is the DMI here, for the interfacial one, you write down what is the effective field, which is the functional derivative of DMI, and it is shown here. So I show it, in fact, graphically on the two drawings here. But you know, you look at the in-plane components. The in-plane components are DMZ dx, DMZ dy for x and y. So it means it is simply something which tells you where is the gradient of mz. So if you have a domain wall, the gradient of mz will be there. This field will be living only at this domain wall, and it will be normal to the domain wall. So think if somebody had told you, devise me a field which exists only at a domain wall and which is always normal, you would say you are crazy. But DMI does it for you. And there is also another component, the Z component of the DMI field, and it looks like the divergence of magnetization. So here to place the Chairman, I showed MFM images of small objects, and by MFM images, we see this in-plane charge. So here they are domain walls, they are distorted by the MFM, but the in-plane divergence you see by the small black and small white color here, or you see the S element. But okay, this one is not so much looked at. People more concentrate on the effect, and you will see in the later slides, but it has this in-plane component that it has on the domain wall. So DMI gives an effective field which is normal to the domain wall for a perpendicular material, okay, which has perpendicular up and down domain. It gives a field normal to the domain wall always, and in a given direction. if you go here, depending on the sign of D, if you go from up to down, it will be, let's say, here. But if you go from down to up, it will be the opposite normal. Okay, it's a chiral field. Okay, so these are some early calculations to microgravity to see what is the effect of starting from 0 value of D and then increasing the D. So here we start from just a perpendicular sample with which has a black hole if there is no DMI. And here I show, okay, these are total moment of the black hole. So at D equals 0, you have a pure black hole, and this is the Néel component, it is 0. And if you, okay, in calculation, you do what you want. You start by increasing the D. You see two things. The first one is that initially the black hole moment decreases, falls to 0. At the same time, the Néel hole moment increases and then saturates. So you have fully converted your black hole at 0D to Néel hole. So there is the first threshold value of DMI. Here we use the parameter of platinum, cobalt, alumina, and it was something like 0.12 millijoule per square meter. And then here I'm plotting the energy of the domain wall versus DMI. Once you are converted to Néel, you have just a straight line that the energy is some constant minus just pi times D. And pi is because we have 180-degree domain wall. It goes from up to down and it rotates by pi. So it's just this. And from this relation, you see that if we, here it's safe, but if we go on increasing the D, at some moment we shall reach 0. The domain wall energy will be 0. And then it's a second threshold. At this moment, when the domain wall energy becomes negative, then your sample should split and create domain walls everywhere. So it's the instability of the ferromagnetic regime. So there are these two values here for the case of platinum, cobalt, alumina. These are the values we get. So the first we look at the statics of the domain wall is Markus Heider with Blügel. And so it's just a scale bar of DMI. Initially, people think there is no DMI, so there you should have pure black holes. Okay, in nanostructure, you can have Néel holes, but in fact, you are living on the DMI axis, and DMI should be never exactly 0. So then there is a first threshold where you go to Néel hole, and then you destabilize your uniform structure to have cycloidal scales and so on. And this, if you remember the first slide I was showing for iron, cobalt, silicon, it was just this, okay, helicoidal case here. Okay, so the proof that we get a Néel hole is difficult because if I think of platinum, cobalt, alumina, because we started with this, the domain walls are something like 5 nanometer wide. So how can you see the 5 nanometer wide domain wall if it's block or Néel? So here it's a SPLIM, so low energy electron microscope with spin polarization, where they could make multi-layers cobalt and nickel on platinum with iridium. And by this, they can tune the anisotropy to be low so that the domain walls are wide and they can see the orientation of magnetizing these domain walls. And you see that by increasing this iridium intermediate layer, so 0.6, 2.5, 3 monolayer, they switch. Here is the color image that they get with reflection of electrons. Here they have Néel walls which are chiral, because you see they can also see the domains. So we are up, down, up, and here we are to the top and here to the bottom. And then at some moment they come back to black hole, which are in fact no chiral because you can have either up or down. And then if you increase again the iridium thickness, they get to Néel walls, but now with the opposite chirality. So it's one of the first experiments showing that you really have this chiral Néel walls. Another one, it's to, okay, it's a little more complex, but finally it succeeded, is to measure the stray field coming out of the domain wall, because the black hole has no special stray field from the domain, it has only the stray field from the domains, whereas the Néel wall, that is here magnetized transversely, it will, here on cross view, it will create an additional stray field due to the domain. And by measuring very carefully, it was very difficult experiment using NV center microscopy, so microscopic technique which was developing at that time, again for platinum, cobalt, alumina, but which they come from spin-tack samples. It was possible to show without uncertainty that there are Néel walls, and moreover, that you see there are left Néel walls in the case of platinum, cobalt, alumina. So it's an indirect proof by the stray field that you have Néel walls. Okay, and now there are more techniques to show it. Another consequence is that if this wall you see has a chiral at a given moment, if you apply a transverse field, you have a competition of two processes. Either the moment rotates within the domain wall, but then you have to fight with DMI and the domain wall energy, or the domain wall itself rotates. And this, in fact, is seen experimentally, and it's one of the early ways to measure the DMI interaction by this tilt of the domain walls. Another very funny consequence is that we can get nucleation from the edge of the sample. So here it's a very complex sample. It's again platinum cobalt alumina from Grenoble, where, because you see the sample was patterned to, it was to have a current flowing the sample, but this sample was reused for this. So the boundaries of the sample are shown here, and here is you have always a defect in this sample. So here is a defect where you have saturated your sample up, you apply a negative field, BZ, and then you shall get a reverse domain nucleating at this defect. So, okay, this defect will always be working. So here, even if we change the in-plane field, it nucleates always there. But you see that if in addition an in-plane field is added, Bx, when you increase this in-plane field to the right, at some moment you see also nucleation from the left edge of the sample, okay? Which is more easy when you increase the X field. And moreover, if you go to the negative X field, the same value where it started here, you see to get nucleation, but now at the right edges of the sample. So I agree this right edge is bad. It should be straight, that would be better. But okay, the sample was existing. But you see here with a bigger negative X-plane field, you get a long domain nucleated from the right. And then if you reverse everything, you start from a down sample, you apply a plus BZ. So here it's a plus HX. So before it was plus HX, it was reversing from the left side, and now it reverses from the right side. So we have a chiral nucleation from the edge of the sample when you apply an in-plane field. And this, okay, these are the measurements of the nucleation field in the center, the nucleation field from the edge, and which in fact goes to 0 at some moment. And again, it comes to the 0 domain wall energy. And okay, by my chromatic calculation taking into DMI, it was possible to get an idea what is the value of DMI in this, again, platinum, cobalt, platinum sample. Okay, another consequence of DMI is that if you have a finite sample, the magnetic moments at the edge will be tilted because they are pushed. Let's say this last moment is pushed by the before last one and not by there is no moment on the right, so it will be rotating. And this can be computed. Okay, it's a very simple problem to solve, and you get that in this uniform case that your in-plane component is just given by the ratio of this D over DC0, the DC0 being the one where the domain wall energy is negative. So it's a very simple calculation. And this, okay, can be said to be an academic problem, but it has some consequences because when some people make small elements for MRAM, for example, if you have DMI, because the element has a shape, this DMI will induce a shape anisotropy because you have some tilt and you will gain some energy either here on this edge here where you are at, or in this edge here. And this can even overturn the shape anisotropy, which is due to the DMAG. So, okay, this is the value, the calculation of a tilt energy, and then it depends on DMI. So, and then it depends on the length where you are tilting for the total energy for the element. So it has also consequences for the static structure. And these are MFM images showing that when you are small enough, it will rotate opposite to the effect of the DMAG. A very recent case study of this is this nice series of papers where people see in the platinum cobalt case, they have either out of plane region and in plane region. So it means they have oxidized only in the out of plane region, there is aluminum. And here you keep the DMI everywhere, but here you are out of plane, here you are in plane. And as there is a DMI, if you are up here, you are here to the left. If you are down here, you are to the right. And then you can switch this element by just an in-plane field, or even by here, we are using a spin polarized current. You can switch them. You switch the in-plane part, and it also automatically switches the out-of-plane part. So in this second paper, these authors have made some logic out of these small elements. So there are direct application of DMI which couples the in-plane and the out-of-plane. You could say that this is a domain, this is like an extended domain wall, and they are coupled here. Okay, so I go to dynamics because dynamics has shown some very interesting things. So initially, okay, all the work we did initially was on platinum cobalt alumina, so that's why you see it everywhere. Here it's a curve showing the velocity of the domain wall versus applied field. If there is no DMI, maybe if you know a little domain wall dynamics, you know that there are two regimes. One, the first regime is the steady state regime, then there is called maximum velocity, or Walker velocity, Walker field, and then you go towards a regime where the domain wall myotation is precessing, and you have a lower velocity. So this is your maximum velocity, end of stationary regime, Walker breakdown, and then the precessional regime. So you see this velocity is quite low here. And it was measured in symmetrical platinum cobalt platinum sample. It was measured, so US. And here, if you have DMI, okay, at that time we didn't know the value, so we added moderate value of DMI. But you see that this steady state regime is extending as you are increasing the DMI. And then also the maximum velocity is increasing linearly. In fact, it's nearly linear, okay, as shown here. This Walker field versus DMI, more or less linear. Okay, there is a small turn here. And so this gives rise to very large domain wall velocities. And an experimental proof is from the PhD thesis of Miami Ron in Grenoble, was to compare the velocity versus field either of a symmetrical sample, platinum, cobalt, platinum, or the non-symmetrical one, which has interfacial DMI, platinum, cobalt, alumina. Here you have the precessional regime with low mobility. In the other case, here, once you are depinned, you go to the stationary regime with very high velocity and mobility. Okay, because in between both, you have the alpha square factor. Another, in fact, more even surprising effect was not to move these walls by field, but by current. So at that time, what was known was the spin transfer torque, and the wall moves by spin transfer torque. Okay, there is this adiabatic and non-adiabatic term, but the velocity, if it's linear to the current, is the adiabatic term. And it was found experimentally that the walls move in platinum, cobalt, alumina. They move extremely well. So it's shown here in this paper. This is a measurement of the velocity. You see 400 meters per second for, okay, 3 TRM per square meter. So it's fantastic value, much better than everything was obtained in permalloy, for example, in the years before. But on the other hand, it is not shown here, but it's measured. But on platinum cobalt platinum, you get no velocity at all. The walls do not move with current, and here they move just and because when it's an asymmetric structure. And again, okay, you have to believe me, I don't show the calculation, but these are the 1D model calculation, which show that in the presence of DMI, you get stationary value of velocity, which is increasing proportionally to DMI. And in fact, in terms of the beta factor of the spin transfer torque, here in this sample of platinum cobalt alumina, it's like if you have a beta of 2. So usually beta is 0.001 or something. So it gives an apparent very, very large beta value. And moreover, in this case of platinum cobalt alumina, the velocity was in fact opposed to what you would expect from spin transfer torque. The direction of motion was opposite. And this explains this. So in fact, it has been systematized by this work of a Beach group, where they have taken, okay, cobalt iron, MgO as top, and then below either platinum or tantalum. So both have, in fact, opposite spinel effect, which is the mechanism which is driving them, but they seem, now it was clear, it's become clear that they give the same DMI, and that's the reason why to get positive velocity, for platinum you give negative current, and for tantalum you give positive currents. And it's a direct proof also of this, okay, driving mechanism together with spinel effect. So, and the velocities are quite high. So about the measurements of DMI, in fact, people have tried a lot of techniques so by the domain wall, and there is still development of technique. I will not give a list of technique to measure the DMI, but it seems that the simplest one is to use Brillouin light scattering. So in Brillouin light scattering, you measure the spin wave, and you can get both in the Stokes here or anti-Stokes process. So either you create a spin wave with the wave vector given by the wave vector of light twice, or you absorb a spin wave with minus twice the vector. So by this, you can compare what is the frequency of the spin wave with one wave vector to the frequency of the spin wave with the opposite wave vector. And if you put the magnetization transverse to this propagation plane, in the plane, so you have to put a big field, then these spin waves, because they are rotating, the AC components are rotating along this field, they are drawing cycloids. And the spin wave propagating one direction or the other, they have a cycloid of one direction or a cycloid of the other direction. And so the result is that DMI is simply, and it's very simple, it's linearly modifying the frequency of the two spin waves. So whatever the complex expression for the energy of the spin wave, and you know these are the Kittel relation, you have to add exchange and so on. DMI is just an additive term, so it's a fantastic situation. And that means you just need to measure the change of frequency, the difference of frequency between Stokes and anti-Stokes as a function of wave vector, which means the tilting of the sample, and you get a straight line. And it should not depend, so it's shown here in this first paper, whatever the field you apply here, so whatever the frequency of your spin wave. So this is the most direct way to measure the DMI. So for example, here, if I come back to this famous platinum cobalt alumina, we measured a series of platinum cobalt alumina samples. These are the frequency difference versus wave vector. And you see that if you start from a fixed sample here, the black one, and you go to a thin one, the slope is increasing. And this is, in fact, expected because from the previous relation, okay, the delta F is proportional to D and K, okay, proportional. But the D is the effective D on the fin. But if you have an interfacial effect, you expect that this effective D is like for the interface anisotropy, ds over T. And that's what we checked here, that, okay, not perfectly, but not so bad. You have a constant ds to explain everything. So in fact, the good quantity to describe what is the value of a DMI of one interface is this ds, which is the unit picojoule per meter. And it seems now, from what I've done, still the record value is for platinum cobalt, this value here. Okay, so I will skip this to show that, in fact, the sign of the D can be obtained by the slope. Either you are positive or negative, but you have to look at the slope depending on what is the orientation of magnetization. But it's very technical, so I will skip. Okay, so this is people have seen, yes, the record is this platinum cobalt. For example, for tungsten cobalt, you get positive value. And the other one is iridium iron, which is a large positive value. But this has been only looked at in UHB. Okay, so the skyrmions, I have some time left. So what are the skyrmions and why do we look at skyrmion? So a skyrmion, if you are old, you know maybe the magnetic bubbles. So a skyrmion, you can say it is like a nanobubble, but it is more than that. So the property, why is it fascinating from the topological point of view, is that this structure covers once all the sphere. So here I have to make okay, it's a calculation where you are here up, in the blue you are down, the domain wall you see here, and it is a circular. So you can convince yourself, it's like the Earth, you are North Pole, you are the equator, and you are South Pole. So everywhere you are normal to the Earth, so of course you are covering all the possible orientations. And this structure, so it's a topological property, and in the literature, it's been called sometimes a topological soliton, because you cannot, if you are covering the sphere 1, you cannot go to zero coverage continuously. I will explain a little later. What is the DMI doing here is that the DMI is fixing what should be the domain wall orientation. So you start, okay, let's say you have anisotropy, so you start from up, you will go to down, that's along your easy axis, and then the DMI is fixing you that you have Néel walls with one given chirality. And this is a big difference compared to bubbles, because in bubbles there was no DMI, so and given the thickness of the sample, they had block walls, but the block walls could have either chirality, so either circulating or contra-circulating, or even you could have block lines in the side of a block wall. So I like them a lot because it's my PhD subject. But the nice thing with DMI is that it is only one chirality, which is here, let's say, plus Néel wall. That's all. That's fixed by this, and it simplifies things a lot. And then I will show that for the motion of the skyrmion, we can go back to what has been seen on bubbles. So with this gyrotropic deflection. And yes, otherwise, and the idea was to apply them like the bubbles to store information and to process it. Okay, so in fact, the same sample I was showing before, iron, cobalt, silicon, just 4 years later, after having observed the stripes, by ranking up the field, people observe this, what is now called the skyrmion lattice. Okay, skyrmion crystal here. And we are in a bulk compound. So you see these are like helixes, the magnetization here, and the skyrmion you see they are like vortices. Okay, so there is outside. This is given by the applied field, and the inside is the opposite to applied field. So you cannot see by Lorentz TM which is up, which is down, but we know from the field history. And the important thing is that all the vortices have the same circulation. See, all the colors are all the same. And on the same sample, by the way, at some other place, they get the vortices rotating the other way because it comes from the screw symmetry of this structure of the crystal. For the interfacial system, I come back again to spin polarized STM. So here is the case, iridium 111, one monolayer of iron, and one monolayer of palladium, because if you don't add this, then you get a more complex structure. And in this sample, it is the same. You get, okay, at low field stripe phase, at higher field skyrmion, and then you are saturated. Okay, it is a complex experiment, you see 8 Kelvin and so on, but you get skyrmions which are extremely small, 3 nanometer. And also, using the STM tip to inject current, it has been possible to write or to delete skyrmions by locally. And then the mechanism is not still fully clear yet. It's a combination of maybe, yes, it's not a spin polarized current, but there is a current, there is a heating and so on. So, but it's possible to create them here. Here I show other example so this one was first, okay, monolayer at low temperature and UHV. So, but I was showing to you before that the platinum cobalt alumina, we have such samples that in room in ambient condition. So here is in ambient condition sample, you have tantalum, cobalt iron boron, and then tantalum oxide. And here is shown that you can even, it's a very funny thing, you can blow skyrmions by just flowing current across this small conductor here. So in fact, you are cutting these stripes into these skyrmion bubbles, and in a good condition. You see the applied field is very small. We come back to this later to keep the skyrmion not blowing up into stripes. And here is an experiment where there was a dot of platinum cobalt MgO, and it's by XMCD to look at the structure. So there is quite some noise because there is only 1 nanometer of cobalt. But you see, okay, by this image, you see both domain wildization and domain wall. You can see that you have a nail wall. And this is an image with another orientation. You see that the contrast is rotating. So it is really a nail skyrmion. And then if you apply some field, it will contract. And if the field goes to 0, it will expand. So it's really a stable structure. So these skyrmions exist. So I was speaking of a topological property of a skyrmion. So from topology, I said you cannot continuously erase a skyrmion. And the idea, if you want, is that if you have a football, yes, because we are in Spain. So if you have a football ball and it's and around it, if you have a glued plastic cover, if you want to remove a football ball from a plastic cover, you have to take your knife and tear the plastic cover to take the football ball out. Okay. So, and then if you are, as soon as you have your knife and you tear the plastic cover, you are doing non-continuous things. So that's why from topology, it should be forbidden. But I've just shown you before, yes, but here we create skyrmion by current. So where is the problem? Or here skyrmions are created. So experimentally it can be done. Mathematically it cannot. So where is the problem? In fact, the problem is that there is no problem. When you want to tear it, we have to introduce a singularity of micromagnetism, which is called the Bloch point. And the Bloch point, it does not have, like you would naively think, an infinite exchange energy. It has an infinite energy. In fact, it has a finite energy. So here are calculations about when you are computing the It's a change of configuration. You start from a skyrmion, you go to uniform, all the energies are changing, and you look, this is the total energy. So you have a small barrier here. And when you are at the barrier, I'm plotting here all the spins. In fact, it is like if you have, instead of your plastic bag, you have a net and you are opening the inside of a net to take the ball out. So in fact, there is no infinite energy which prevents creating a skyrmion. So that's why it works. And here we show the barrier. The barrier, of course, increases with the DMI value, as you would expect. Okay, so the problem of what is the size, what is the energy, and so on of skyrmion is a complex problem. So you can, of course, always say, I will do full microbiology calculation for my case. Perhaps it's the most simple approach. Otherwise, there have been tried to prepare some semi-analytical or partly approximate approaches. And so I will show two papers. But in this paper here, they vary the diameter of the skyrmion and they look at the energy. So, and then here they compared three values of DMI, middle, intermediate, and higher. And for example, what is quite interesting is that, okay, this is for a given thickness of a sample and given exchange, given field, everything, just changing this. And you see that sometimes you can have bistability, where here you have a deep, low energy for a small structure and not for at a much bigger structure, small energy. And that's typically what you get in this thin film. So the skyrmion created in the cobalt iron boron, they are rather 1 micron, so they are here. But if you change a little the parameter, you can have them. And okay, you can even have a critical, or this one, the skyrmion goes automatically to the bubble. So this is the full phenomenology. And here it's another paper. So it keeps these parameters constant and change now the magnetization and the anisotropy. And here it shows the skyrmion radius is shown here as a function of anisotropy. So there is a skyrmion phase and the small skyrmion will get them. And here below is shown what is the stability effective energy. So if you want to get a 60 kT like in the magnetic recording, you should be there, but then your skyrmions are big. So if you are small, then it's rather 20 kT, so it's not sufficient. But and what is important, it shows here that if you go to lower and lower magnetization, you will get smaller skyrmion compared to here, because you avoid all the magnetostatic effects, which are in fact what was stabilizing the bubbles. Okay. So yes, the chairman will tell me when I should finish, but if we look at the dynamics of the skyrmion, and in fact we use what has been done for bubbles before, so it's the famous Thiele equation that everybody is using now, which was developed for bubbles, and this Thiele equation looks for the steady state motion of the domain, assuming that it will not change its shape. And then it expresses the Landau-Lifshitz-Gilbert equation as a balance of three forces. The force you apply, a damping force, okay, reversible force, the damping force, and then a force which is called the gyrotropic force, and which was typical for bubble. Okay, so you see the dissipation, you have the alpha there, and then it's a gradient square. This is the force you apply from what you are doing. And the new thing is this gyro vector. The gyrotropic force. And if you look at this expression, in fact, you can rewrite it like that, and then you get that it is just a way to count the surface you are covered on the sphere. So in fact, the gyro vector, it is proportional to the number of times you cover the sphere, which is called the skyrmion number. If you cover it once, or minus once, or even 2 or 3 times. And the important thing is that the gyro vector is just proportional to this, to the topological number, but it does not depend on the chirality. So here I'm showing Néel skyrmion one way, the opposite chirality Néel skyrmion, and the Bloch skyrmion. They are all covering the sphere exactly once. So they will have the same gyro vector, even if they are plus Néel, minus Néel, or plus Bloch or minus Bloch. So this chirality term is not taken into account in this gyro vector. Okay, so but the gyro vector again, if I compare this skyrmion to the opposite one where I just switch the inside and the outside, It's like for what is being done for Vortex. This fermion number, okay, that's the number type you cover the sphere. There is the winding number, which is given here, and then the polarity of the core. So if you reverse the polarity, you will reverse this G vector, and then the gyrotropic force will be reversed also. And this is a test that many people are using to get it. So for example, this is the same material where I was showing and the same team, the blowing up of skermion. Look, you have a white stripe, you have a dark skermion, so it starts at the bottom. You move by applying current to the right. You see that your skermion moves progressively to the right, and at the same time, it was starting from the bottom edge and it goes to the top edge. So it goes to the left. And if you reverse, now you have a dark background, a bright skermion, you have the same current. So the skermion moves again to the right, but now it will be turning to the right. Okay, so this is the opposite gyrotropic force, and it comes from the fact that we have just reversed this. We have the same DMI, so we see the same thing, but the chirality does not count, by the way. It's just the winding number is still 1, and then the polarity is opposite, so the G vector is opposite, and it goes the opposite way. And this, okay, sometimes it is called Skermion's Hall effect, and sometimes this is a problem because if you think you have a stripe, the skermion will try to exit from the stripe. Another very interesting phenomenon is that you can have also a Hall effect due to a skermion. So there is an obvious Hall effect because the skermion is a reverse domain, but also there is what is called a topological Hall effect, which is due to the fact that you have a structure. So if you take big skermion, so it's a systematic measurement shown in this paper, they get for large skermion, or not so large, 100 nanometer diameter, they get that the topological Hall effect is 1 per 1,000 of the anomalous Hall effect. But if they are reducing the diameter to 100 of it, so then the anomalous Hall effect would reduce by 10 to the 4th, then the topological Hall effect would be 10 times. So if you have very small skermion, then your Hall effect will be saturating to the topological Hall effect. And the topological Hall effect has been measured in skermion lattice and also so on. Okay, so maybe I will stop here. So the conclusion is that the DMI, so the interfacial DMI, is completely, I think, revolutionizing the magnetism ultrafin films. And I've shown you that it changes the statics, the dynamics, and it allows to create new structure. And the important aspect that it is introducing some chirality. Okay? And the chirality comes from the fact that you have the breaking of inversion symmetry because you have a substrate below and then the layer and then the cap layer on top. If you take platinum cold platinum, then you restore symmetry and then you remove this interfacial DMI. And this effect that is like 1/, thickness, so quite rapidly it can dominate the standard Buck effect. So for example, the Dmag energy of the domain wall, which is proportional to the thickness, whereas the DMI will be 1/, thickness, so at some threshold thickness, it will switch from block wall to nail wall. Okay. And then this chiral nail wall will move very fast, and then they can move by the spin Hall effect, which are the block wall would not, and so on, and the skermion. So it gives a full menagerie of zoology of structure, which can also respond to the spin orbit torques. So now this research area is quite blossoming. So the open question now, and it's my list, there might be open, but I've shown you only metals up to now. But now a lot of people are looking at oxide interfaces. So for example, there are reports on YIG, on GGG, both are insulators, okay, where you get some, apparently some DMI. Also, cobalt with graphene, you get some DMI, there is no heavy element. Cobalt with topological insulator, there seems there is DMI too. There is also some evidence that in a single layer, so with no special substrate, you can get a DMI in the layer itself, and it seems to be due to the fact that the composition is not homogeneous. So for this, the rare earth transition metal alloys are very important. And also the DMI can be controlled by electric field. In fact, it has the same symmetry. To apply a perpendicular electric field, it has the same symmetry as having a substrate bottom and not on the top. For the skermions, so the goal is still to get small skyrmions which are stable and which move very fast. So small, and this is quite difficult. So for the easy motion, people are thinking of using either synthetic antiferromagnets or ferri or antiferromagnet, because then you can compensate the gyro vector and you have no deflection. Moreover, if you take an antiferromagnet, I was saying that to get small skyrmion, you need to have no magnetization. So an antiferromagnet is a good choice to have no magnetization. So then the skyrmion is well controlled by the DMI. What is difficult now is to have skyrmions moving very easily at low current. So initially for the bulk samples, people were showing the motion of a skyrmion lattice, and it was moving at very small current density. But here for memory, if we want to move single skyrmions, they are not pushed altogether by the others in the lattice, and then there is some pinning. So it is important to, on the material side, to be able to develop ultra-thin films which are asymmetric, if possible antiferromagnet or synthetic antiferromagnets, and with no pinning at all, ideally. And one way to test this, okay, I did not elaborate on this, is that in this case, you should have some Brownian motion of skyrmion and they move by themselves randomly, like living objects that Brown saw a long time ago. Okay, so that's my view of what is happening now in this subject, and there is still a lot of activity on this subject and a lot of ideas for new materials.
Thank you very much, Andre, for this very nice talk. I clap my hands, and and it's fascinating how you started from the very beginning, from the pioneering papers by Jelazinski and Morilla, and it's fascinating to see how what they discovered in the late 50s is now becoming a very trendy subject. So we have a first question from Ron Goldfarb. He says, "Bonjour, Andre," because he's in the United States. And he says that the DMI interaction applies to surfaces and interfaces. Is there a lower limit to thickness below which DMI cannot arise? As an analogy, conventional ferromagnetic exchange requires a 3D structure.
Okay, so it's a good question. Okay, we answer experimentally. We spent a lot of time with the SpinTech and so on cobalt 0.6 nanometer. So 0.6 nanometer is 3 atomic planes. Okay, so you can go, you say to 2, we can to go 2 and 1. At 2 atomic planes, we don't have it magnetic, but there are some people in Korea which can, but I think it must be an alloy and can have it magnetic, and they see something. The limit will be 1 atomic plane, but no. And then on the calculation side, we have done some calculation, ab initio calculation, which shows that if you start to intermix, for example, platinum into cobalt, which probably exists for these already 2 atomic planes, then you will be decreasing the DMI. So, but from what we know from the, if we can make a monolayer, okay, but look, sorry, take the Wiesendonger case. They have shown 1 monolayer of iron and iridium, and they do the growth at very low temperature. There is no intermixing, they can see, and then at 8 Kelvin, the sample is magnetic, and they get a huge DMI because the sample is never homogeneous; it's always rotating. So that's, there is, in fact, it works. No limit, I would say.
Okay. Second question now from Jorge Lobo. He says, "Thank you for the very nice talk." And he's asking, in this gyroscopic motion of skyrmions on thin stripes, does it get destroyed as it collides with the sides? Is there no topological protection?
Good. It's again a very good question. So yes, it can. It in fact is not destroyed. It will simply go out. So there is okay. There are some papers which compute the energy barrier, but the energy barrier is not that big, and then the skyrmion can just simply and continuously go out of the stripe. So if you do the micromagnetic calculation, it goes out. So in fact, the idea has been to, some people were trying to kind of, if you want, either you irradiate along the edges or you change the properties so that you will increase the barriers to keep the skyrmion inside. And the same group was showing some skyrmion which are reaching the boundary and then going by this like a cycloidal motion, colliding with this and then going up. So not, but if you push too much with current, that you are then you apply a force to the skyrmion on the edge, and then it will overcome the stabilizing barrier, and then it goes out. So it's a way to avoid the topological problem. Just go out, and it's continuous. There is no problem. And the same also to beat it. If you want to create a block point, you cannot create a block point inside a sample. You have to or you create a pair of block points when it's possible. Otherwise, you inject a block point from one interface. So which is the opposite mechanism.
Okay. And then we move to the last question because we are almost in time now.
Yes.
So Muad is asking, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is about antiferromagnetic skyrmion. Is it possible to have high DMI values in antiferromagnetic structures to stabilize skyrmions? And what is the skyrmion Hall angle values for the case of antiferromagnetic skyrmion? Is it really null?
Yes, so the second part of the question, it will be 0, yes. There is a paper by, the first paper to look at this is Ezawa. There is a paper by Ezawa, perhaps 2017. Yes, of course, it is 0 because if you think of the two networks, one will have plus J, the minus will have minus J, because you see the M2 will be opposite to M1, and the topological number will be M done dm dx dm dy, so there is 3 times M, so 3 times minus 1 is minus 1. So the skyrmions on one lattice will have opposite J of the skyrmion on the other lattice. The total is 0, so then yes, no deflection. For the first part of the question, in fact, the antiferromagnets are perhaps the best materials to have DMI, because look, what did Jaroszynski look at? He looked at antiferromagnets, which have a weak ferromagnet. Okay, because these are quite complex structures and they have some DMI. So, but okay, in this case, the DMI gives rise to weak ferromagnets. So it transforms the antiferromagnet into a small effective ferromagnet, which has very strange properties. So, okay, but to answer clearly your question, we know many antiferromagnets which have a bulk DMI, but if you want an interfacial DMI for an antiferromagnet, at the present time, and given my knowledge of literature, I don't know that I think it does not yet exist to an antiferromagnet where you would get a very large interfacial DMI and where you would have perpendicular magnetization to get a good skyrmion. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know all the literature.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre, for the talk and the questions. It's been a pleasure. And now we move to the next.
Okay, so I have to quit sharing screen now already. Okay.
Okay. Now
okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.